Hi. This week, the topic is the marketization of higher education. Now, the main premise of this lecture is that not everything should follow a promotional logic. There are some things in society that probably should remain outside of capitalist norms of buying and selling. And I would argue that education is one of those things. So, in order to sort of make that point and then to talk about the impacts of the newly marketized environment in higher education, which is universities, first I want to talk a little bit about the function and the purpose of university. What is it there for? Then I want to talk a little bit about the changes that have come into play, mostly in the last 10 years, that have really led us to be in a realm where we have what's called the marketized university or the marketization of higher education. Then I'm going to talk about the consequences of that commodification and how that actually impacts not only you as students, but me as a lecturer and academic and the industry as a whole. And then a few takeaways at the end. At the end of the lecture, hopefully you'll agree with me that some things are sacred and probably shouldn't necessarily follow a promotional logic. And yet, promotional culture has infiltrated the university, and I don't think we're ever going back. And unfortunately, that has led to a lot of negative consequences for you as students and also the universities themselves. But let's back up. What is the purpose of university? What's it actually for? You know, universities are really important institutional structures in society, and they are made up of big communities of people, both students as well as academics and researchers, and they're big employers for a lot of people doing a lot of really good work in society. And so really at their heart, they are sort of communities dedicated to the learning and the personal development of the future, right, of students. And they are also sources of expertise where research happens and where people who are very educated, understand the way the world works and can talk about it. And they also contribute a great deal to society and nations. The role of the university is vast. It's really not just about to churn out graduates who can get jobs. It's about a place where knowledge is created and where it is generated and where it is circulated. So knowledge at its heart sort of comes out of universities first and foremost. It is also about equipping graduates with viable skills and education and learning so that they can enter the job market and be contributing members of society. It's also there to provide a rational and timely criticism of areas of public policy. So whereas if the government is doing something wrong, you've got researchers on the ground who can kind of look at that and say, this isn't right, or to, provide a little bit of a critical commentary on the way the world is working. They're very large, influential bodies in civil society. Again, they generally hold important people, important repositories of knowledge, and they're tended to be held up as very important institutions. And also they're really important in terms of helping build community and build cohesive and tolerant communities going forwards. And so by students interacting with people from all walks of life and different areas, and by diversity and inclusion being a part of university experience, students learn how to adapt and learn how to work with other people, and then they grow up to be more tolerant people, which then leads to better communities and societies. And so you can't argue that students get a lot of access to things in university that they wouldn't get otherwise. And generally being university educated means that your world opens up and that you become a person with a higher character that is more tolerant and inclusive of other people, which makes the world a better place, thanks to universities. However, this is fundamental. We know this about universities, but what we have seen, especially in the last 10 years, is major changes in the roles of universities. As society has changed, so have universities. And in this last decade specifically, what we've seen is a market logic enter into the university realm. And so market mechanisms have been introduced into universities that were never there before. And this is important to note because, again, universities were large institutional structures within society that did not have to apply itself to market or promotional logic. They were there to serve a public good, which was educating the future workforce and contributing to knowledge. But like neoliberalism and capitalism, And like promotional culture, nothing is immune, even education. And so what ended up happening is we started to see that competition was introduced and a market mentality was introduced to universities. And we were told that this was a way to make universities more effective, more competitive, more aligned with the way that the world is. And so notions of sort of demand, supply, and also price were kind of brought into the mix where they never really were before. And this is fine in the private sector, but again, if it crosses over into an area like the university, there are problems because the university education is not the same kind of product that you can simply apply these market mechanisms of demand, supply, and price to in order to make it competitive. It's a different kind of product, and we'll go through exactly why in a little bit. So first, let's talk about why this even happened. Well, there have been, especially in the last 20 years, we know through market capitalism and through sort of right-wing neoliberal ideology that society has really adapted and co-opted this market mentality in all facets of life. So what we've seen, for example, in the government, especially in the UK and the US and Canada, was this drive to push more and more students to go to university. So previously it would have been 20 or 30% of the population would go to university. Now they were pushing for 50, 60%, 70% of people to get an education, mostly because a lot of the jobs also required a university degree. So there was a huge demand to create more university places so that more students could actually get the degrees so that they could progress more in their life. This was coupled with what we call austerity and the reduction of the welfare state. And so universities used to be fully publicly funded institutions. And because the money came from government, there was a cap on how many students could actually go to university because obviously the government was paying for them. Now, you may not know this, but in the UK, up to 15 years ago, you could get a university education for free. You didn't have to pay. There were no fees. And this is still the case in many European countries, such as Germany, where the state, the government pays for the education of the workforce for the future. But as governments began to contract, get smaller, using neoliberal right-wing ideology, they decided that it wasn't the role of government to pay for education, and in fact, they were going to defund universities. And so the reduction of investment from the state led to universities needing to find new sources of revenue. And this sort of, again, came from this very neoliberal, very ideological belief that the market should actually run everything. And so it's not about what the government should not be involved in these things. The government should not be investing in large-scale public service investments or public goods. It should all be open up to the market. Again, supply and demand would dictate the price, and there would be competition, and everybody would win. This is the ideological market mentality. The other thing that really happened in the last sort of 10 or 15 years is the international higher education market has exploded. Now, again, this goes back to the fact that China, India, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, etc., they started having a rising middle class. Travel became easier, and a Western degree was a very sought after piece of paper. And so there was a lot of opportunity for students from all across the world to go to especially countries like the UK and the US for their degree. And this has become a huge market because obviously the universities realized that they could charge more money for these students to come, and there was a bigger demand, and so the supply of degrees that were targeting international students also increased, again raising the price. Market mechanisms of supply, demand, and price. So all of these factors in the last sort of 2 decades coming together have meant that a market mentality has totally permeated the higher education sector, and what we now have is what we call the marketization of higher education. And so there are a lot of influences here that we have started to see in the last 10 years that have affected this product. The first being is that you're now seeing a lot of for-profit providers entering the market. So again, it's no longer about a public good. It's about, getting a higher level degree at a higher price, and you have these private actors coming in and offering sort of a better product, I guess, for a more prestigious product for a higher price, and there's more competition. You also saw, for example, that tuition fees, not only were they introduced, but they were significantly raised over a number of years. And so in the UK, students never had to pay tuition. All of a sudden, in the sort of mid-2000s, it was a low amount, maybe £2,000 or £3,000. And then all of a sudden, after 2010, as we know, the rates have gone up to $9,250, which is what you pay now. And that money is meant to actually pay for your education, because the universities are no longer getting that money from the government. They need those fees to pay for their services. And so they're very driven by student numbers. We've also seen that what used to be called maintenance grants are now called maintenance loans. And so again, students are no longer given money to attend university. They have to borrow it. And it's very common for most students to graduate with 3 years university with a debt of 30 to 40 to 50,000 pounds. And in the US, it's even higher. And so students are absolutely getting saddled with it's no longer the responsibility of the public realm to pay for the future educated workforce. It's your responsibility as an individual to pay for your own education. And again, that marks a very big change in perspective. We've also seen that institutional rankings have become very, very important in terms of the competitive marketplace. So students and professionals are constantly looking at league tables to see who's come out ahead. And there's thousands of surveys done, and we're constantly sort of asking about your satisfaction in order to make sure that our rankings are improved, because the rankings will dictate how many students we end up getting. And because we are now reliant on student fees, we need to get more students, as many students, frankly, as possible. And so, it's driving this sort of competitive race to be the best. The crazy thing is that it's almost impossible to actually get an accurate judge of where these universities sit. The mechanisms are so complicated and so colluded that it's impossible to really get an accurate measure of what you're going to actually experience in your own degree. And then, because universities are now in competition with each other, they are devoting huge resources to marketing and PR and branding. And they've never had to do this before. They've had, they receive students on the strength of their programs and the strength of their offer. But all of a sudden, it's all about advertising campaigns and social engagement and open days and recruitment fairs and retention efforts. And there's all this money and there's all this staff now being hired at universities to market the universities. And some of you might end up getting a job like this. And marketing is expensive. So universities are having to spend a lot more money to market themselves. And so they need a lot more students. So it's a constant sort of hamster wheel of trying to get ahead of the competition, and frankly, it's not effective, and it really hurts universities. So going to Farady's reading, he talks about, the fact that when you have a marketized higher education environment, you actually lose something in the product itself, because it's not a product that is designed to be marketed. It's not a product that's designed to be a commodity. And so the commodification of higher education actually leads to what he calls standardization and calculated and formulaic teaching, and it reduces the quality of the experience into the quantity of how many students can we get through the door, how many can we get graduated, how much money can we make, essentially. And so it's less about a proper, handing over a proper education and arming the future with skills, and more about a transaction, a financial transaction that has very little to do with actual education. So let's talk about that a little bit, because there are some major consequences that come from this marketized environment. The first is that, again, because it's supply and demand, And because the universities are no longer receiving funding from the government, there is this huge pressure to get as many students in the door as possible. And every university is experiencing this. Even the Russell Group, the high prestigious universities, they're all under pressure to attract and enroll greater numbers of students every year. Whether they can support those students or not, whether they have the staff to be able to teach them properly, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, the budgets need to balance, and there's a huge pressure to just open up more and more and more spaces. Rising tuition fees. Again, hard to believe, but your £9,000 does not actually pay for your entire education. And so it's a bit of a weird market, because it's actually not driven by purely supply, demand, and price. Because if it was, the prices would have to skyrocket, because it's actually costs a lot more than that to educate you. And that's the fees for your lecturers, it's the building costs, the utilities, the staff fees to run the university. It's all of the time, effort, and energy that goes into it. The IT infrastructure, all of that does not actually pay for it. And so again, there's this constant sort of hamster wheel of never really quite getting ahead. But at the same time, the government has mandated that fees have to stay a certain amount. And so universities can't really raise them because they've all decided that is going to be the rate. The government has set a max, and so all the universities have charged the max that they can, even though they actually need more. The money really should be coming from government, though, not from you. What we've also started to see is the proliferation of courses on offer. Again, as a way to entice more students to attend university, universities are opening up their programs like crazy. And so you have thousands of different master's degrees, for example. You can get a master's degree in absolutely anything and everything. And pro tip, it's not that hard to get in, because a master's degree has kind of become the new BA, and it's sort of like a basic stepping stone to getting into industry. And so universities are becoming more and more creative in terms of the types of degrees that they offer, trying to entice students to actually come to be there and try to set a differentiation point or a unique selling proposition in order to entice students. We've also seen the growing internationalization of universities. And so again, as a way of creating more money, a lot of universities have campuses overseas. Middlesex is no exception. We've got campuses in Dubai and Mauritius, and we've got a franchise in Vietnam. They pay us fees to recruit students to their program. We give them the materials and that we teach. Works just like McDonald's. They basically have bought the franchise for the Middlesex BA Advertising, PR, and Branding. Looks great for Middlesex because we're an international university. Looks great for the students in Vietnam because they get a London degree and they never have to leave their own country. But, this is a consequence. This is what universities are having to do. And universities are doing this all over the world. There's partnerships in every country, as well as massive recruitment efforts to try to bring in international students, especially from Asia, because they will pay. And they pay, if your tuition is £9,000, a student from Asia is paying roughly £17,000 per year. And that's the international fees. And guess what? Next year, European students are also going to have to pay the higher student fees. They will no longer be eligible for UK fees because of Brexit. So we definitely have this internationalization of universities. The marketing costs are escalating. It's expensive to market and brand a university, and universities are spending a lot of money on building fabulous athletic complexes and halls of residence and grounds and football pitches and all kinds of things to entice students to want to come so that they can get better rankings, as well as the marketing costs themselves. And again, none of this is free, and your fees have to go somewhere, and it's this constant sort of race to make more money. And that leads to intense financial pressures. Most universities in the UK are suffering financially, and the pandemic has only made it worse. We will talk about in class how the decision to do face-to-face teaching by a lot of universities was directly related to the financial pressures that they're facing, because they needed those students to come in and pay their rent on their accommodation, because they get more money from accommodation than they do student fees. And this is a big problem because universities aren't actually financially viable and a lot of them could actually go under if they don't get funding, and the government has offered no assistance. So they've expected universities to be privately run and functioning like a market, except they don't actually let them do that, and then they don't help them when they're in trouble. And again, we have this heavy reliance on income from foreign students. And I've taught on programs where 9 out of 10 of the students were from China. And, most of those students, frankly, probably weren't even eligible. Well, they didn't have the credentials to even get in that program, but they were willing to pay. And so especially if you go on to a master's degree, you will see that it is heavily financed by international students. And that's how universities make their money back, because they have to. This leads to the biggest problem that we have in the marketization of higher education, which is basically looking at the situation as if it were transactional. So it's this sort of idea about, the relationship between, academics, your teachers, and you as students is very transactional, and it's a service provider to customer. And instead of thinking about students, as the future of the workforce, as people who are interested in learning and growing and developing, treating them as customers actually has major, major problems. And I would argue that you're not customers, you are students. And, again, Ferretti says if the student is purchasing instruction or simply buying a credential, what's going on here? If we started to treat students like customers, could they simply buy their degree? And there's a reason why there is a big problem with this, because again, that sort of notion in sort of capitalist sort of market society, the customer is always right, that doesn't work quite well for students, because at the end of the day, the student is responsible for their own education. You pay a fee and we facilitate your learning. We facilitate your education and development, and we give you all kinds of tools. We inspire, we motivate, we show you the path. But ultimately, the responsibility for your education is yours. And you are, your success as a student is going to be heavily dependent on the resource and the investment that you put in. So, universities are not a university education is not a product that you can simply buy. It is something that you have to do most of the work on to actually realize the benefit and get the outcome of it. And if it works out for you, that's great, but that's basically on you. You can't, as a student, say that you didn't get a good service or you didn't get a good product or the customer service was bad if you didn't like your teacher. And again, it puts your teachers in a really difficult light, because we're doing our best to ensure that you do have a good university experience. We are working very hard to make sure that you are getting access to the information that you need, and we are making it readily available. But in the end, your experience and your satisfaction with the product is down to your hard work, your commitment, and your dedication. And no other product is really like that. So how can a university be treated as nothing more than a commodified product if it's actually so different? And we're going to watch some videos in class that show you some of the broader issues around this and why it's so problematic to start thinking about the university as a product and students as its customers. So a couple of takeaways on this lecture. First of all, I don't think not everything in life should subscribe to a market logic. There are certain things that should be sacred and should not have to adhere to the constrictions and the paradigms of capitalist markets. Education should be a public good. It should be something that is available freely to all so that society can develop and so that people can get an education and be the best people that they can be, and so that they can then contribute to society through good paying jobs, paying their taxes, and making a society a better place. Saddling students with ridiculous amounts of student loans to pay ridiculous fees for a product where they feel like they're a customer and they want to get value for money out of a product that becomes our responsibility to deliver is simply not a sustainable model for higher education. Unfortunately, it's the one we've got. So at the end of the day, the marketization of higher education doesn't actually serve students because, again, it gives you this false notion that you are paying for a service or you're paying for a qualification that you have every right to or deserve to get, whether you put the work in or not. And it puts us in a position of having to be service providers where we become your mental health counselor, your coach, your motivator, your teacher, your facilitator, your grader, your, your everything. And you are, you as a student sort of considers that to be a product that you're paying for. Nobody really wins. And we're all doing our very best to ensure that you do get the best education that's possible. But at the end of the day, it's up to you to get that value for money. So who benefits from the marketization of higher education? Well, a lot of people would say the very highly paid administrative staff working in universities, vice chancellors, etc., who are making £300,000 to £500,000 a year, the more and more levels of senior management that is required to run the university like a corporation. They make a lot of money. Academics don't make a lot of money. And, the market benefits, I suppose, but actually at the end of the day, the people that the university is supposed to be there for, who is the academics as a research and knowledge community, and more importantly, the students who are there to develop themselves and to learn as much as possible, don't benefit from this market mentality. That's all for this week. Be sure to do the readings. They're very good and they give you some really good insights. We'll watch a couple of videos in class and I really look forward to our discussion.